There is a type of manipulation that almost never begins with a threat, an obvious lie, or a cruel attitude. It starts small, so small that it seems absurd to question. A simple favor, a quick order, a silly concession, and that's exactly why it works. Because most of the time, the manipulator doesn't want the first thing he asks of you. He wants to measure you. He wants to discover how far he can go without you noticing. You want to test how much discomfort you can handle in silence. He wants to know if you're going to explain yourself too much, if you're going to smile to avoid bad weather, if you're going to say okay, even when everything isn't okay. And if you understand this mechanism, a lot of things in your life start to make sense. Relationships that drain you, conversations that make you feel awkward for no clear reason, people who seem harmless but always come out with some emotional advantage. This video is about that, about the small request that doesn't seem like anything, until it becomes access. Maybe you've already experienced this and haven't even named it.
Someone asks for just a minute of your time and takes your piece. Someone says it doesn't cost anything and makes you carry a weight that wasn't even yours. Someone invades your space with enough delicacy to seem polite, when in fact they are making a cold reading of your limit. And the most disturbing thing is that this almost never happens in a dramatic way. The most efficient manipulation is not breaking in. She enters through the crack. That's why this topic matters so much. Because understanding this game can save you guilt, confusion, and exhaustion. It can help you realize sooner what you previously only understood too late. It can show you that the problem was not that you were too sensitive, too difficult, or too closed off. Often the problem was different. Someone noticed that you had difficulty denying it, and decided to use that. And whoever is here has already felt this discomfort, that strange feeling after agreeing to something you didn't want, that weight in your chest after saying yes out of politeness, that thought that comes hours later. Why did I accept this? It's not an exaggeration. It's not paranoia. In many cases, it is your body realizing before your mind that some boundary has been touched. The most dangerous thing about this type of dynamic is that it hides in everyday life. It doesn't just appear in extreme abusive relationships. It appears in friendship that always demands a little more, in the colleague who turns kindness into obligation, in the person who tests your time, your energy, your silence, your patience, everything in a light way, all in an almost socially acceptable way. And that's precisely why so many people take so long to see it. Because the real test is never in the order size. It's in what happens inside you when it's done. Do you feel free to refuse? Or do you already feel guilty before you even respond? This is the gateway to today's video. Not to make you suspicious of everyone, but to give you clarity. To show you how certain profiles use minimum orders to map emotional obedience. To help you recognize subtle signs that go unnoticed in the rush, routine, and desire to keep everything at peace. Because sometimes the beginning of a controlling relationship doesn't come with major abuse. It comes with a small order that seemed to mean nothing, and that's when almost everyone lets their guard down. There is a pattern that is rarely noticed at the time it happens. He doesn't scream. He doesn't force it. It infiltrates. And the most uncomfortable thing is that you often participate in it without noticing. The manipulator doesn't start by asking for something big because that would activate his defense immediately. It starts with something small enough that it seems almost ridiculous to refuse. An adjustment, a quick favor, a break this for me. Nothing that, in isolation, would justify a real inconvenience. But here's the thing almost no one sees. It's not the request that matters. It's the response you give to it. There is a psychological principle that has been extensively studied within social psychology called behavioral consistency. When you accept something small, your brain tends to remain consistent with that decision in the future. You begin to build, without realizing it, a silent identity. Someone who accepts, someone who collaborates, someone who doesn't create conflict, and this becomes a map. Experienced handlers don't need much time. They observe micro-signals, the time it takes you to respond, the tone of your voice when accepting. If you justify yourself too much,
if you laugh to soften, if you show any discomfort, but still give in. And when you give in, even if for something small, important information is recorded. You are approachable, you are malleable, you avoid confrontation. And from then on, behavior changes, but almost imperceptibly, because the next order doesn't come as an obvious escalation. It comes just a little further than the previous one, still acceptable, still justifiable, still within that limit that you yourself helped to establish without realizing it. In your everyday life, this can happen absurdly common RMS. Someone who starts by asking for help with something simple, and then starts counting on you as the default. Someone who invades small chunks of your time, and suddenly starts taking it for granted. Someone who tests your emotional availability with light conversations, and then proceeds to unload problems on you without measuring the impact. And when you realize it, it no longer feels like a request. It seems like expectation. Now for a second, have you ever had someone who started out asking for little and ended up taking up too much space in your life? This is the question that almost no one likes to answer honestly, because when you respond, you start to see patterns that are not comfortable. You begin to realize that it wasn't out of nowhere, that there was construction, a slow advance, a progressive adjustment of your limits. And the most disturbing thing about all this is that, most of the time, there was no direct imposition. There was reading, there was a test, there was strategy, and it completely changes the way you interpret certain relationships, because it stops being just about sloppy people or boring situations, and starts being about psychological dynamics, about someone who, consciously or not, learned that small requests reveal big gaps. If this has ever happened to you, simply say, "I've seen that." No need to explain, just acknowledge it. Because when you start naming these types of experiences, you stop blaming yourself and start observing more accurately. And this is the point where a lot of people wake up. But there is still a detail that makes all of this deeper. You have not only been tested, you answered the test. There is a specific, almost invisible moment when everything changes. It's not when the handler makes the order. That's when you accept it. This moment is silent, fast, socially acceptable, and yet decisive. Because when you say yes to something that has already generated slight discomfort within you, you are not just helping, you are communicating. It's sending a clear signal without even realizing it. My limit can be adjusted. And the most disturbing thing, this sign is not interpreted emotionally, it is interpreted strategically. Research within behavioral psychology shows that when someone accepts a small request, even though they are uncomfortable, there is a significant increase in the likelihood of accepting larger requests later. Not because the person wants to, but because they start to support their own image of someone coherent. In other words, you start to convince yourself that this is normal. And this is where the gears start to turn. Because the manipulator doesn't need to insist. He doesn't need to press. He just watches. He notices that you gave in even with micro signs of doubt. He understands that there is a space between what you feel and what you allow. And that space is everything. In everyday life, this happens almost banally. You agree to change a plan that was important to you. You accept hearing something that bothers you without reacting. You agree to resolve something that was clearly not your responsibility. And all of this is accompanied by small internal justifications. It's no big deal. It's just this once. It's better to avoid the problem. But the brain doesn't register this as an exception. It registers as default. And the handler too. There is a detail that few realize. Manipulators don't trust what you say. They trust what you tolerate. Because tolerance is predictable. It's measurable. It's repeatable. And from the moment you tolerate something once, it becomes a reference. Now pay attention to this. The manipulator doesn't always react immediately after you give in. Sometimes he waits. He observes other contexts. Test in different situations. Adjust his behavior based on your responses. Like someone calibrating an instrument. Like someone learning exactly where they can touch without generating resistance. And when you least notice it, He already knows more about your limits than you do. This is uncomfortable to admit, because it breaks the idea that everything is spontaneous in relationships. It shows that, in some cases, there is cold reading, there is calculation, there is intention behind attitudes that seem natural, and you feel it, even if you can't explain it. That feeling that something is a little out of place, that slight tension that appears after certain interactions, that internal doubt that you try to ignore so as not to seem exaggerated. This doesn't come out of nowhere. This is perception. If you've ever ignored this type of sensation just to maintain harmony, say, "I've felt that." It's not about exposure, it's about recognition. Because when you realize that you are not alone in this experience, something changes. You start to trust what you feel more. And perhaps this is one of the most important points so far. The manipulator doesn't need to force you to do anything. If you yourself learn to push yourself beyond your limit, his work is already half done. At first it looks the same. Same person, even same lightness. But it's not. There is a change happening. It's just not in visible behavior. It's in the intensity. It's in the frequency. It's in the naturalness with which things start to be asked for, or even not asked for anymore, because there comes a point when the request disappears and it gives rise to expectation. You don't realize exactly when it happens. There is no clear framework. There is no, "now it has changed." It's a slow slide, almost elegant, almost imperceptible, as if the relationship was adjusting itself, when in fact it is being shaped. And the strangest thing is that you follow this, without questioning as much as I should have. What used to come as, "Can you?" starts to come as, "Do this for me quickly." Then it becomes, "You solve this, right?" And when you realize, you're already doing it before they even ask. Automatic, silent, conditioning. This is the silent climb. And it does not depend on imposition. It depends on repetition. Each previous small concession creates an easier path to the next one. The brain seeks to save energy, so it prefers to repeat a known behavior rather than generate conflict. And that's exactly what the manipulator relies on. It doesn't need to increase much. You just need to increase it enough. At work, this appears when you become the person who always helps, until you become the person who always solves things. In friendships, it appears when you start by being someone available, until you become someone who is emotionally responsible for the other person. In close relationships, it appears when you start giving up small spaces, until you realize that you barely have any space left. And no one announced this change. It happened because it was allowed. Now watch this calmly. The manipulator does not accelerate too much. He knows that sudden changes arouse resistance, so he keeps everything within a level that still seems acceptable. It still looks normal. It still feels like you could say no, even though you no longer do. And here comes a point that completely breaks the common perception. It's not about the size of what's being ordered. It's about how far you've come from yourself to accept it. This is the true indicator. Because externally, it may seem like little. It may seem insignificant to outsiders. But internally, the distance grows between what you feel and what you do, between what you would like to answer and what you actually answer. And that distance is tiring. But you don't identify tiredness right away. He appears later, in the form of accumulated irritation, in the form of social exhaustion, in the form of wanting to walk away without knowing exactly why. And you often direct this at yourself, thinking you are being intolerant, cold, or complicated. But that's not it. It's limitware. If you've ever caught yourself doing something automatically, without even remembering when it became your responsibility, comment automatically. Just that word, because this reveals a critical point. When you stop noticing the process, you start to live the result without questioning it. And that's exactly where control stops feeling like control, and it starts to seem routine, and then it happens. It's not a fight. It's not a confrontation. It's not something big enough to justify an external reaction. It's internal. A feeling. Subtle, but insistent. You are in the middle of a common interaction, something that has happened before, something that is theoretically normal between you, and suddenly a discomfort arises that is difficult to ignore. It doesn't come as clear thought. It comes as tension, like a light squeeze, like a desire to retreat that you can't explain. And yet, you continue, because it doesn't seem logical to interrupt. It doesn't seem reasonable to question. It doesn't seem proportionate to react. After all, it's no big deal. But it is exactly at this point that something important is happening. Your internal system is detecting an imbalance. There is a concept in psychology called cognitive dissonance. It's when there is a conflict between what you feel and what you do, between your internal perception and the behavior you maintain externally. And the more times this happens, the more you start to disconnect from yourself in order to maintain the coherence of the relationship. You feel something is wrong, but he continues to act like everything is fine. And this creates a silent fracture, because over time, you start to trust what you feel less. It begins to ignore legitimate internal signals just to maintain external stability. You start to prioritize the comfort of others, while your own discomfort is pushed to later. After, until later becomes the standard. And here is the point that many people avoid facing. The manipulator does not create this fracture alone. It depends on your unconscious collaboration. It depends on your tendency to minimize how you feel. It depends on your need to maintain harmony. It depends on how difficult it is to sustain a no when it can generate any type of tension. And that's not weakness. It's conditioning. It's social learning. It's emotional history. It's everything you were taught about being pleasant, understanding, easy to get along with. But in the wrong hands, these qualities become access, and you feel it in your body before you understand it in your mind. That slight resistance that appears, but you ignore it. That urge to say no, but you soften it. That moment when you realize you didn't want to be there, but you keep going. This is not an exaggeration. This is perception trying to protect you. Now think honestly. How many times have you felt like something wasn't right and still carried on as if it were? This is one of the most difficult questions to face because the answer almost always comes with greater discomfort, realizing that you participated in the construction of this dynamic, not by conscious choice, but by silent repetition. If this touched something real for you, comment, "I felt it before." Not to expose anything, but to make this point. Because when you start to validate what you feel, you start to recover something that has been gradually reduced, your internal reference. And without that reference, any boundary can be crossed without making a sound. Now change perspective for a moment. Stop looking at what you felt and start observing who was on the other side. Because there is a pattern of behavior that does not appear explicitly. It doesn't come with a label. It doesn't come with a warning. He presents himself as someone ordinary, sometimes even pleasant, functional, socially adapted, but behind that, there is reading. The limit tester does not act on impulse. He watches first. It scans the emotional environment. Notice who avoids conflict, who tries to please, who takes time to disagree, who explains too much. He identifies patterns quickly, not because he knows you deeply, but because he recognizes repeated behaviors in many people. And that gives you an advantage, because while you're still interpreting the situation as something casual, he's already collecting data. How you react to small intrusions. How do you handle light pressure? How do you respond when you are placed in an uncomfortable but socially polite position? And the most disturbing thing? He rarely goes over the limit all at once. He pulls over, walk away, pull over again, like someone testing the water temperature before getting in. This type of behavior does not depend on aggressiveness. On the contrary, it is often accompanied by sympathy, quick closeness, an initial feeling of connection, because it reduces your defense. It makes you let your guard down. This creates an impression of security that does not necessarily correspond to reality. And here's a point that changes everything. It's not about liking or disliking you. It's about functionality. If you are someone who facilitates, who absorbs, who supports. You become useful within this dynamic. And when something is useful, it tends to be exploited, not necessarily consciously, but consistently. And this explains why some people repeat this pattern with different individuals. It's not personal, it's a behavioral pattern. Now observe more accurately. The limit tester often reacts in specific ways when encountering resistance. Sometimes he backs off quickly, as if nothing had happened. Sometimes he turns it into a joke. Sometimes he minimizes it. Wow, that was it. Did you take it seriously? All of this has a function: to reduce the weight of the situation and maintain control of the narrative. Because deep down, he needs you to keep doubting your own perception. It needs you to think, maybe I'm exaggerating. And when you think that, it maintains access. There is also a subtle emotional coldness to this profile. It is not a total absence of emotion, but it is a low level of emotional interference in decisions. He is not guided so much by guilt, discomfort, or empathy when testing. He is results-driven, for what works, for what generates response, and this creates a strong contrast with whoever is on the other side. Because while you are worried about not being rude, not hurting, not creating a climate, he is evaluating how far he can go. If you have ever noticed someone who seemed to measure their reactions more than truly connect, comment, he observed. Because this recognition changes the game. You start to leave the position of someone who only reacts, and start to see the behavior. And when you see, the dynamics lose some of their strength. But there is still a critical point, because understanding does not automatically mean being able to act differently. This is where everything gets more tense. Because noticing the pattern doesn't solve the problem. It just makes it impossible to ignore. You start to see, start to notice the tone, the timing, the type of request, the way things are placed. You begin to notice that slight advance that previously went unnoticed, and for a moment it looks like it will be different now. But then comes the critical point, the moment of say no. And strangely, it doesn't come with relief, it comes with pressure. A pressure that is not external, visible, direct. It's internal, psychological, social, as if there was a silent risk in simply setting a limit, as if something could break, like you're about to cause more discomfort than you should, and then you get stuck. Because in the end, it's not just about the current order, it's about everything that has been built so far. Each previous yes created an expectation, created a history. You created a version of yourself within that relationship. And when you try to step out of that role, it feels like you're betraying something, even if that something was never fair to you. This is confusing, because no starts to seem aggressive, even when it's necessary. And the manipulator, even without saying anything directly, supports this scenario. Sometimes with silence, sometimes with a subtle change of expression. Sometimes with a light phrase, but full of implication. Relax, let it go. Said in a way that makes you feel like you are the problem. And in that moment, control reveals itself, not as an imposition, but as an influence. You feel like you can say no, but he also feels like he will pay for it in some way. And that feeling is enough to make you step back. Now, pay attention to this question, and answer honestly, even if it's just for yourself. How many times have you known exactly what you wanted to say, but changed it at the last minute to avoid the other person's discomfort? This is the point where a lot of people get lost, because you start negotiating with yourself. I'm not going to talk now. I'll sort it out later. It's not worth creating an atmosphere. But this later almost never arrives, and each postponement further reinforces the pattern. And the manipulator notices, even when you think you covered it up. Because it's not about what you say, it's about what you sustain. There is an important detail here. When you finally try to impose a limit after a long sequence of concessions, the other person's reaction may seem disproportionate, not because the order was big, but because you broke predictability. You stopped being consistent. And for those who were supporting this generates reaction, sometimes subtle, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes enough to make you think about going back. And it is exactly at this moment that many people retreat. not because you don't know what to do, but because you feel the impact of doing it too much. If you've ever been at this point, knowing what needed to be said, but feeling that saying it would have a high emotional cost, comment, "I got stuck." Because this stuckness is not weakness. It is the result of a silent construction that took place over time, and understanding this changes the way you see yourself. But there's still one thing missing, because realizing, feeling, even wanting to change, it doesn't guarantee that you'll get out of it. What guarantees is what you do the next time you are tested. The next moment always arrives, and it is not announced. It doesn't come with warning or time for you to prepare emotionally. It appears disguised as normality, a simple request, a small adjustment, something that, if you weren't paying attention, would pass exactly as it did before. But now, you see, and that changes everything, because the game remains the same. The difference is that you are no longer. There is a second of silence before his response, a minimal, almost imperceptible space where something happens. It's not explosive courage. It's not an intense reaction. It's colder than that. It's clarity. You notice the pattern, notice the repetition, understand the path it can take if you respond as you always have. And for the first time, you don't react automatically. You choose. And this choice doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to be long. It doesn't need to be explained. A real limit is almost never accompanied by excessive justification. It comes clean, direct, no effort to convince others, because deep down, it's not about making others understand. It's about you not betraying yourself again. And here's the part that few people talk about. When you break the pattern, the other person notices it immediately. Sometimes you don't react right away. Sometimes he maintains the same tone, the same posture, but something changes in the dynamics. Because that space that was previously available is now no longer available. And that repositions everything. Some people will back off. Others will test again. Others will simply lose interest, because the ease no longer exists. And this may feel uncomfortable at first. It may generate doubt. It can feel like you are being too tough, too distant, too different. But that's exactly it. You are different. And this difference is not a problem. It's a sign. A sign that you have begun to recognize your own limit before someone else needs to cross it. If this makes sense to you, comment, "I saw the pattern." Not as just any phrase, but as a milestone. Because the moment you see clearly is the moment you stop functioning on automatic. And there is the important thing that needs to be said, without softening. Manipulators don't need you to trust them. They need you to doubt yourself. And when that doubt disappears, access disappears with it. You may still encounter this type of behavior at work, in close relationships, in unexpected situations. This doesn't disappear from the world. But the way it hits you changes completely. Because now there is perception, there is a pause, there is choice, and this breaks the cycle. If this video brought you this clarity, share it with someone who always ends up giving in without realizing it. Not as criticism, but as a warning, because many people are still living this pattern without being able to name what they feel. And in the end, it was almost never about the order. It was about who you became every time you said yes when you wanted to say no. And this is one of the quietest ways to lose control over your own life, without realizing it, until you realize.